Well, here we are. We're lighting the candle, a world that works. Every week we get together and we talk about whatever it is that we feel is appropriate in the moment. And the whole idea here is to bring empowerment to ourselves and to you, our listeners. And today we have four people on our panel. Uh, I discovered last week after explaining who's on my right and my left that it doesn't show up exactly the way that we see it afterwards. So I'll let you figure out who Ken Caputo is, and I'll let you figure out who Lisa Sheehan is. And our buddy Jan Jeremias is coming on right now. So we should have a real ball today. And again, I'm Bill Carell. We've been doing this now over 100 episodes. Thank you all for your kind listening. And there she is. That's our Jan Jeremias, hot and on the scene.
No, no, not hot today for sure.
So we've done our introductions, and we're hopping on and just going to dive right in today. And we've talked about a lot of things over the last almost coming up on 2 years, believe it or not. That's crazy. But the same thing uh, is possible in every single conversation, no matter what we choose to talk about. And I love this term that I came up with. I don't know if y'all like it or not, but I conversational alchemy, where we're looking for and creating gold in our wordsmithing, and really kind of diving in and bringing as many different approaches and examples as we can to you, our listeners. So with that said, I'm going to jump in, and this is the thought that I have for today. I would like to talk about two things that I'm sure we can get handled in 15 or 20 minutes: the meaning of life and the secret to my success. I think both of those are there. There's some kind of like overlap and some corollaries there. But being a child of the 50s and 60s, it was very important for people, to find out, who they were and find out what their life was all about. And the interesting part of it is that people have made billions of dollars helping people through that journey, some with some success, some with not as much success. But how do you guys like the idea of those two topics in terms of a conversational cornucopia? The meaning of life and the secret to my success.
It's too
I
much
guess.
for an hour.
Well,
I know it's not for an hour.
Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy makes it really easy. Wasn't it just 42?
Yeah, 42 is the answer. That's the meaning of life.
Okay, we're done.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So the whole notion of there being an answer to either one of those two questions is you know is there gold in them bar hills, or is it kind of like being asked to guess how many jelly beans there are in a jar?
So it feels more like when we talk about mastery, like I'm not fond of they use the title master in martial arts,
Yeah.
and it's an honorary thing, but the way I was always taught mastery isn't something you achieve, it's a process you commit to, you
Yes.
know. So, so to me it just feels like it's less about the meaning of life and more about, recognizing the meaning in your life, which that's definitely a long conversation, very unique to each of us as individuals and who we are in this moment.
Completely agree. And when you talk about the meaning of life, um, not only is it personal, there is no answer out there waiting for you to find it. It is a generative process, in my experience. That I had a guy who once told me, he said, "You can think about why you're here, or you can go do it." He said, "There's no in between. This is definitely either this or this. You can think about why you're here, or you can go do it."
I'd make one addition to that. Uh, you know, you can go be it.
There you
You
go.
know, there's like, it's that whole thing about human beings as opposed to human doings, and it's interesting, especially in the entrepreneur world. You spend a lot of time in activity, and not just resting in just the value of who you are and are becoming. You know,
Yeah.
you'll find the balance in there somewhere.
Yeah. And I don't know how is it for you, Jan, when you think about your journey through your lifetime. The neat part of all of us here is we've got a few trips around the sun between us, and some more than others. But the point is, Jan, was it ever a priority to you to really go and get answers to some very fundamental questions in your life?
Um, yeah, I think that you, you have two choices when for me, when I've gone through challenges, I always got to a place where I always look deeper. There had to, not in a kind of practical way almost, but obviously an internal, an internal reflection or an internal processing, which came from, all the experiences that you had and an understanding on a deeper level, because otherwise life happens and, you know, I don't want to say that there's no solution, but I think then almost the things that do happen seem meaningless. And so there was always this process of like trying to reflect on how that came to be for myself
Right.
so that, I could learn and grow and maybe not repeat the same mistakes or the same circumstances wouldn't keep happening over and over and over again. So I see you're smiling, Bill.
This would be a great time for me to ask you that 100 persons question. How old when you first noticed you were the problem?
Mm. That's right. It's like, I remember going on vacation once when I was going through some really challenging times and I got back and my mother said, "So how was it?" I said, "The issue was I went." Like I went on vacation, it wasn't like, and that's when you realize that, all of a sudden you're like, oh, okay, I didn't, I went, all my issues and all the stuff went with me, so
That's amazing. Yeah, it's another way to look at that is no matter what mirror you're looking in, you see the same thing.
hmm absolutely.
Lisa, how about you?
It's interesting because I was away this weekend, and one of my friends was having a difficult time, and it all stemmed from losing her son. So it was a profound loss, and it happened a while ago. And but all of us kind of shared a tragedy, a too early tragedy in our lives. So um, I was sharing with her what I had done, and trying to change my routine, and then to reflect on the fact that what I've learned through spiritual practices too is that the divine is experiencing life through you, so that you want to give it your best shot, kind of thing. You want to show your earthbound journey the best you can be. And nobody, even those that you lost, will want that anything other than that for you. So, why not move forward and give it your best earthbound journey, kind of thing.
Yeah.
And there's other books I shared with her and things like that, but it took me, I thought money was going to be the answer at the beginning, and so I read Conversations with Millionaires, and that led me to Jack Canfield, and that led me to The Secret, and then it was one step after the other. But if I hadn't suffered a huge loss, I don't know if I would have gotten there, if I would have asked that question, is that all there is? Are you just do you just be born and be dead? And I knew that wasn't the answer, so I
Yeah.
kept looking.
It's an interesting time to be alive simply because in our lifetime people have had access to affluence in a way never before. I mean, and this is a worldwide thing. It's not just in the United States. The poorest of the poor in the poorest country they've got access to things that 50 and 75 years ago were absent. There was nobody there to help out ever. And in our country right now, if you stop and think about it, can you even imagine somebody in the uh, like the 1920s, 85% of the population living beyond their means? How would they do that? There was no credit. You might be able to get a bag of flour, or a pound of rice or something like that till Thursday, but those folks couldn't buy homes. They couldn't buy automobiles on time. They couldn't borrow for college educations. They couldn't borrow for vacations. The concept of trading your future work value for money in the present is something that had to be designed by banks a little bit at a time, lending institution, investors, that sort of thing. And so, is it possible that something like affluence could really be an obscuring of someone's journey and search for the meaning of life?
It would
I think
depend
it
on your
could,
relationship to it.
yeah, it could obscure it.
Well, see, the thing is that all of that, everything we have now is like the air around it. It's like, we don't have any you know, relationship to it wasn't always like this. My dad bought his first car, in 1951, and he paid $63 for it. Can you even imagine? Cash. The first loan that he took was on the GI Bill when he got out of the service. And you know what that was for? The first home he ever bought and owned. Paid $13,500 for it. And he also had 3 kids at the time.
But I'll throw out a different concept is I don't know if it's necessarily money, when you um, are looking for or feeling distracted, because I actually think success works the same way. So I don't know that it's necessarily monetary depending on the world you grow up in.
Please say some more about that. Like
I
a little
think
bit more fleshing out on not being money, but
just whether it be the number of university degrees you have,
right.
or maybe not the money but the prestige of the job, or depending on your field, how much you've published, so all of a sudden success or being successful takes on a different meaning, not necessarily monetary, and it depends on whether, let's say, academics is really stressed in your upbringing, and then all of a sudden it might not be how much money you make. It might be like how many degrees you have.
And that almost gets to be a family community sort of thing, where people who are the first one in their family to ever graduate from high school, or the first one in their family to ever graduate from college, or the first one in their family to ever have one of their children go to college. All those kinds of really cool things have happened in great numbers over the last 50 to 75 years. I'm posing. And I'm wondering if it's easier to get from here to there without the struggle that it took. Like, for instance, the people who, like the Elon Musks of the world, they're not successful because everything worked out for them, or that they were the recipient of a couple of lucky paydays along the way. Seems to me that somewhere along the way there were choices that a man like Elon made, and I'm not asking you to give a value whether you think he's good or bad or anything, but you stop and think about he didn't graduate from college. Most of the billionaires that are around these days didn't. They just didn't, especially if they're tech oriented. But the question is that if affluence gets you to a stage in your life where you're comfortable, is there a possibility that maybe the enemy of the best isn't the worst? It's good enough? now that we're talking about the secret of my success. And I also heard something this week that I thought was very powerful. You want to be successful, it comes down to choices. Making good, strong life choices that aren't based in what's good for you in the moment, or choices that allow you to stay the same way that you are right now continuously over a long period of time. So when you start talking about number of degrees, how big your house is, how many cars do you have? Do you remember when we were kids? Do you have a color TV? You know, can you imagine like what a low threshold for success that was back in those days? Could your parents afford a $75 color TV instead of a $35 black and white?
I think it's also your upbringing, like you said, because my father truly believes that some of the overnight successes, the biggest uh, billionaires, millionaires, industrialists, must have had lucky breaks. He doesn't necessarily believe that they all really worked very hard and they took extra, like overnight successes that you think were overnight successes, and it took them 12 years to get there.
Or 40 years to get there. Yeah,
Right.
exactly.
But he honestly believe, he would never get a lucky break. He never got a lucky break. He earned whatever he had, but he was never going to be one of them, the rich people. There's us and there's them. So then guess what philosophy he passed on to me, you know?
Here's an interesting thing about that. Jim Collins, in his work in Great by Choice, he talks about return on luck was the determining factor in success, and this is specifically in measurable, companies that perform 10 times better than other similar companies. This is direct apples to apples comparison, and he said that all of those companies had the same instances of luck, so it was how they were prepared to actually leverage the fortunate events and amplify the impact of that. That's what made the difference. So that's an interesting thing because I'm sure if you were to talk to the businesses that failed, they would say that they didn't have that luck, but it's really not that. It's their view and their
Mhm.
decisions when the opportunity arose that were different and led to that. Whether it's intentional or unintentional is, you know, neither here nor there. But there, it's so, and that was an interesting thing because for me that was a pretty cool paradigm shift. It's not no one's more lucky than anyone else. It's the opportunity is always there. It's just what we do with it, and what's your view, you know.
It's
Well,
like that saying, the harder I work, the luckier I get, you know? I'm sorry, Jan?
Yeah.
no, I was going to say it's also, well, how many people really fail because they just give up? Or
Yep.
and so going along with that, how many people are willing to stick it out and just say, okay, well, this didn't work, I'm going to try this, or and just kind of say, okay, well, didn't work. And I think in the entrepreneurial world that happens a lot, where people, for multiple reasons. The other thing is, I was curious about to ask Lisa what she, or just everybody, based on and how much of that measure of success is, or just not only your measure of success, and I said based on degrees or status or
Yeah.
however you want to say, may not be financial, but how much of that is also determined by gender. you know I don't know how old Lisa is, but I grew up and it was kind of like, it had moved out of like, if you stayed home and had a family, it was definitely like you were giving into a model which kind of had begun to die, like, which was not fashionable. It wasn't, that's not what you wanted to do. And I'm not saying it's good or bad, but I remember thinking to myself, like, I'm not going to stay home and raise kids, like, I'm going to go out and have a career, you know. And so I wonder how much of it also is gender specific, or at least at that time. I think it's actually changed again a lot, but when I was in college, that was a big thing.
Well, I also think that there's been a shifting point on the horizon of what the Klan success target is. And it's been brought about, a lot through mass media, um, advertising, what we see at the movie theaters, what we could buy at Sears. Um, the really interesting part of it is that there's a sobering fact, which is, to borrow Al Gore's terminology, it's very inconvenient and it's true. White people aren't the richest people in the United States per capita. Asian Americans eclipse them by about 40% more of the highest income earners and the highest degrees and then right behind them. And Asian Americans is comprised of first Japanese, then Chinese, Koreans, and Vietnamese. And these are Americans. These are first generation folks whose parents came here and whose shoulders they stood on while those parents made hard choices for their children and set the bar really, really high. And they lived their lives, in many cases, everything for their kids, and then their kids actually respected that and were the return on luck. The harder they worked, the luckier they got. They have amassed the most amount of fortunes, and then after that are Indian Americans, and then I think white people are like number four in line. And it's a sobering fact when people say that there's something that's given to certain people or a certain sex or certain. I know women that I worked with in the 70s and 80s who were very much aware of the shift that you were talking about, the paradigm shift from the one working person in the house, mom stays at home, raises the kids all the way through high school and college, and then after that, if she wants to go find some fulfillment or something, this might be a person, a really highly intelligent, degreed woman who wound up getting married instead of going into a law practice, or instead of being a doctor, or instead of being a high school teacher or something of that nature. So I'm interested in what were the choice gates, if you will, the yes, I'll do this or no, I won't, that would cause some people to choose the yes, I will go ahead and do this and break out of that traditional, all your friends are doing it type of a thing, to the point where no longer were women staying at home with their children. Most of them, in their 30s were going out trying to start a new career or get a college degree in their 30s and 40s. It's a very interesting time for us to go through. I can't speak from a woman's point of view at all, other than my mother's, who I watched go through this transformation between 1976 and when she passed away in 2012. I'm going to write a book about her one of these days. But if I understand what you're saying, Jan, um, there is an awful lot of that I got to see through the prism of how her life, how I understood and how I absorbed what I saw from her.
Yeah, and I don't know whether like that for me, it never came. It wasn't a family thing. Like it wasn't like my mother was hugely like pro women going out and getting. I think it was much more of a kind of societal kind of flow that I kind of tapped into
Yeah.
for me. And if anything, in my family, it was actually maybe that was part of the reason I did it. It was actually frowned upon. So that might be a whole nother conversation, where like how much do we do because we know, we don't want to be like our parents or whatever, but which would be an interesting conversation. But that, but for me, it was much more, connecting in and just also what I was surrounded by. I mean, I went to college in Manhattan. I was around a lot of, when I started to work, I was around a lot of very successful, very business pro career women. And that was, that was their goal.
Yeah.
That was what they wanted.
You're speaking my language. That's exactly who I was talking about being around in the 80s and 90s. These very, very successful, I mean, like oh my God, successful women in Manhattan.
Exactly.
And, all walks of life. I don't care if we're talking about journalism or fashion or photography or magazine editors, all that sort of thing. It just seemed like there was this unbelievable explosion of a few people who said, "There's no glass ceiling. I don't buy into that. Now let's get busy."
I had the
I wonder what it was like for them when they closed the door at night and turned the lights out. Yes, Lisa.
but I fell into what was going on, like exactly what you were saying. My mother went back to work while we were in high school, and I was the oldest of three girls, and we were never told. I never remember feeling like because I was female that there was some, a hurdle that I would have to cross. I know. So my mother gave me a good example of being both a mother and a working woman, and then I didn't want to have a regular job, so I wanted to be creative, and that was the only thing that switched me. But then I still ended up with a job, and then got stuck in and then 40 years went by.
Just like the Pink Floyd song.
So I've also experienced what my niece graduated from UConn, and she doesn't want to be in a 9 to 5, and I don't want to see her in a 9 to 5. And then she just got a job as a 9 to 5er, and
Yeah.
I'm afraid that 40 years is going to pass for her, I just don't want to see that for her. Mhm.
It's kind of interesting, kind of refocusing back to and re-experiencing the two topics that I mentioned, the meaning of life and the secret to my success. I've been listening to some pretty interesting speakers and some people who are sort of taking on the challenge of transforming inner city life and what we've seen in terms of statistics with single family homes, no father being present, in the home, of children in many cases not knowing who their father is, and men who have dozens of children scattered in every major metropolitan area across the entire United States. And what they're saying is that the system, as Ken is fond of saying, is producing the exact result that it is intended to produce, and that those people who have created this problem will not be the ones who can actually solve it. But they said, in terms of changing the structure, that it's really documented across the world that kids who are raised in two-parent homes um, do much better long term and in greater volumes than when in a single family home, especially where that single parent home, where that single parent has to also work and provide for them and leave them on their own a lot. So if you looked at it from the standpoint, they say, of what are the three most valuable things that a kid can do in any family, and the answer is, you may have heard this, but the answer is number one, graduate from high school. Number two, get a job. And number three, have children after you are married and have a partner. You do those three things, life suddenly becomes a lot easier for you to make quantum leaps to whatever might be available after that. And if you look at, in life where most people have been successful, I think there's a pretty good intuitive argument, although I don't have the statistics to back it up, that might be part of the reason in the major groups where people are advancing in technology, advancing in finance, and having a real strong generational wealth, you know, and just basic cultural cohesion, if you will. That those three things: graduate from high school, get a job, and wait until you are in a sufficient partnership to have two people in the home to have children. It's an interesting kind of a model. I'm curious what you think about that.
Well, one of the things that strikes me is if you look at those three groups, in general, they have a very strong family hold, meaning it's not only their immediate like family, a familial network of support usually. I
Yep.
mean, look at the people that I know, you know, in those communities, and they're still very, I don't want to say, I don't know how, but still work very much how I think we did in this country in the past, where, parents lived near children, lived near siblings, and were there as a network or a community, what, we might call a village, but that village at that time was your family. And so I look at those communities, and I think part of it is that they don't do a lot of this alone. Like, I think that kids are raised by multi-generational or sibling, like, there's like a community that raises your kids. And so I think that when I look at success, I think that, they have that extended support, which maybe in other cultures or in other places they do not have.
I look at that like a two-edged sword, if you will, or the front of the hand, back of the hand. Not only do you have support, but there's no place to hide.
Right. Well,
Don't even try to get away with it. But I
that's
think it's very, very astute. And there's one more aspect to what they're talking about that I think is also very important. I mentioned it earlier in the conversation, but good choices. Those three things set you up to have fewer bad choices you must make, you know, where you're more in charge of what's coming at you and the pace that it's coming at you, where there's not all of this survival thing that kicks in, and you don't get the ability to make good choices about the next thing you're going to do in terms of growing yourself in your life. So I guess that makes a four legged table as opposed to a three-legged stool. So Ken, you've been around kids for an awfully long time. And I know you well enough to know that you go beyond the people that are standing in front of you. You get to know them. You get to maybe experience their family. Who knows if maybe you actually trained entire families in the same group, or I'm sure of that.
Yeah, multi-generational. Yeah. I mean, actually the people running the martial arts school right now are second generation, and one of them started with me when they were 5. And and I guess it's kind of interesting. I've seen successful, I guess, whether you want to call it a family unit or, I mean, and our whole thing was, just being an ally for, for everyone that walked through our door and helping them grow to be responsible, contributing adults, even if they're 40 when they start. And, it was like our running joke. So, and saw that happen regardless of the cohesiveness of the family unit. Um, Saw some that came from broken homes that went on to do amazing things, some that came from incredibly stable homes that ended up in really rough situations. Some of them are no longer with us even, some of them handed everything, and it all was for naught, so it's just such an interesting thing. I think that, I question, and from my own personal experience, I think it's more to what Lisa said. It's what's the village around you, or maybe Jan said it, but that support, that you have, and also the fact that that support is a broken cup. Like, our dojo was a lot of people referred to it as their family, as their community, as their support network. And it was that for a time until they were ready to move on and build a community of their own or join another community that better aligned. But it was fluid. And I wonder sometimes if part of the challenge we all face is we get stuck, so we're holding on to a system that no longer serves us because we've evolved or changed, but we're holding on to it out of some sense of obligation, or not recognizing the impermanence of things. I don't know if I'm making sense, but it's just kind of interesting because I'm looking at almost 40 years of you know just contributing to the growth and development of my fellow humans, and there's no one thing that stands out, other than the values that we kind of just tried to distill and put into the design of every business we've ever done, which is, kind of create an environment that allowed for meaningful human connection and an empowered ability to learn, and learn that you can make bad choices and you can navigate through that, and have bravery to take a risk and make a bad choice and navigate through it, and then find joy in the present moment. And those are the only connections I've really found.
Well, what's immediately coming to mind, you're absolutely correct that the village makes all the difference in terms of the trajectory of a child's um, potential. And I'll take you back to my experience, in the inner cities in the 1990s. We had rampant gangs in every city. If you remember, we had like an influx of Crips and Bloods who were expanding their reach all across the United States and into Canada. I mean, we have more south of the border gangs these days that are making a big splash in the news. But I can remember going to Roxbury, and there were 91 shootings in the first 6 months of the year. They thought that was a lot compared to some of the other cities that we've got right now. But the point is that um, there were a lot of single parent mothers talking about how they can't keep tabs on their kids, and at the ripe old age of 8 or 9 years old, the gangs are already indoctrinating them and teaching them how to be safe and teaching them how to belong to something, and getting them to be in a dogmatic way more attached to them than to anything else, in the entire city of Boston. No church, no school. I mean, there all these kids were dropped out of school usually by the time they were 12, 13 years old. And you may remember that the gang slogan was, die by 21 or you're done. And that was really the way that they looked at the world. Like they had the life expectancy of a fruit fly, and they didn't know what day it was coming, but almost every single teenager knew that they were going to get shot by somebody by the time they were 21 years old. And I had no way to relate to those kinds of comments. But if you stop and think about it, when somebody says, those four things that we talked about: graduate from high school, uh, get a job and wait until you have a partner, to have children, a life partner, and then make good choices. What do you have to do to the community and the background and the culture to make that possible? I mean, is this something we could take into inner city Chicago right this minute with, like, 34 to 50 gunshot victims per weekend? And the reason I'm bringing this up is that, do you know how many people have actually gone outside of the inner city and made really successful lives for themselves? More than you would think. There are a lot of kids who figure out a way to make something different happen in their life. So, beyond the academic conversation of what, you know, what's the meaning of life and what are the secrets to my success, doesn't it kind of say, get yourself as high up the independence ladder as you possibly can, as you said, Ken, to find a community that will allow you to grow like a weed as opposed to one where you have to be afraid to go outside during the day?
Actually, I will. That what you were quoting from Michael Singer, the way he actually said it is every system is perfectly designed to deliver the result it's
It is
currently
perfect.
delivering. So it's not like that someone intentionally even designed it.
Right.
I think a lot of these things, like those cities, one person didn't have some master plan. It was people making various decisions, some very self-serving, some altruistic that had unintended consequences, and here we are. So which makes it very hard. It's very challenging to untangle those things. And whenever I would go and work with kids in those environments, um, it was always fascinating because the first concern they have is just survival. So it's really, really hard to think about going beyond that, when you're just doing what, most of human existence was just don't die until you've procreated. So that's a very, that's a challenging place to have a more evolved conversation from. And I remember one of the most powerful things, used to do this leadership thing. I was working with this group, and it was playing this game about smiling. And and the idea was, if you smile at someone, they can't help themselves, they'll smile back. So so I did it with this group, and these kids were in exactly the kind of environment that you were saying, and it did not work.
at
They
all.
had trained themselves, there was no freaking way. But I got them because what was funny was they could school themselves to be completely flat, expressionless, till they thought the exercise was over, and then the first thing they do would be smile. And then I'd get them, and they and they would laugh, and it was really kind of cool. There was a lot of connection and interesting conversation that came out of it. But then all of that, the second they went back into their environment that was designed for them to be in a place of needing to survive, they
Yeah.
went right back to who they were. Nothing I said was going to impact that because it wasn't removing them, like you're saying, from the environment. So all you could hope is that you were planting some seeds that would make me help them start to look for that community in the moments where they weren't focused on survival. You know, it was challenging. I had lots of sleepless nights, you know.
Yeah. So you're now reminding me, and this is a really good segue into what do we do, if we do anything, or who do we be? Okay. So you know the story of how to train fleas?
Yep.
Okay. So there's three parts to this story. First, there's the part where the fleas are in the jar and it has no cover and they just jump out at will. Part number two is you train them to not jump any higher than the top by putting the lid on, and they hit it over a series of times and they stop trying. Once you take the lid back off, they never try to jump out again. And then what happens, Ken?
After they've all been trained that they can't jump out,
Can't jump out.
yeah, get one flea to jump out. Yeah, you put a flea in there that knows how to jump out, or all it takes is one, you know, and then they all
First,
start coming
makes
out.
it possible for all the rest.
Yeah.
And I really think that's a powerful message, that you don't go into a neighborhood and try to get all the fleas to jump out at the same time. You need some people to break away demonstrably from the pack and be able to show how they did it and recreate that process for the other people that want that off ramp, where you give them a different choice from joining the gangs by the time they're 12 years old.
Mm. I think
Yeah,
another
it's oh, sorry, Jane, go.
oh, no, I think another key is that, even though it's kind of hard to show in that story of the with the fleas, is that, it's another of the same kind doing it. So it's not someone coming from the outside, let's say, trying to help these kids to show them how to get out of where they are. Because I don't think, that person who comes in isn't had never grew up there, didn't live there, didn't, experience the same things they experienced. And I think about that with my dog, because my dog was afraid of water. It doesn't like water. And it's interesting because he's a black lab, but he doesn't like it. And literally, we were at the park and my nephew was with him and he wanted him to go in and he kept on trying to get him in. And I kept on saying, no, 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 no. If you want to get him in, he has to like watch another dog go in. Like
Yeah.
that's what he needs. And we went back like 2 days later. No one else was there. There was another dog in the water that he wanted to play with because he loves to play. And he went in the water, not deep, but it was like the deepest he'd ever been in the water. because he stood on shore in the beginning and he was crying because he wanted the dog to come out and play with him. And then he was kind of like, okay, I'll like venture in. But it was only because he watched another of his own species do it.
Yeah, the interesting part of what Ken was saying, the fastest way to get a flea to jump out is to put one in that doesn't know it can't jump out.
That's right.
So
Hmm.
the really, really interesting part, I mean, I've watched many movies. You have too, Stand and Deliver, the Jaime Escalante story, where he just decides that he's going to teach what, ninth graders to do calculus. Uh, and it just goes on and on. There was a real famous superintendent of schools in Illinois, not in Chicago, who completely transformed a whole school district. And then it's almost like it died on the vine. We stopped hearing about it. But these kids went from a dropout rate that was pretty, par with other cities and what have you, to get a 95% graduation rate, and kids that were fluent in at least one other language besides English, and a large portion that did really well on their CAP tests, and they led the entire state. They went from being a really, you know, this is a lost cause type of a school district, and this superintendent changed everything. And I was very much in love with the stories that I was seeing. And he was a public speaker, and he was on television quite a lot in the first probably 2006 to 2008 timeframe. Then I never heard of him again. And I'm just wondering, when a crackpot goes into a school system, we had a guy like that, in my daughter's second grade class. His name was Dave Cohn. He's actually still a teacher here in the Wyndham school district. But he was a clown. He was a real clown in France, and his clown name was Opa, and he was this dynamic 6'3", well conditioned professional clown that had worked with circuses and everything in the United States as well. And he had this take on children. You don't have to tell them much. You only have to show them once. Then you get somebody else to replicate that behavior. Then you put them in charge of showing other kids how to replicate that behavior. So he came to our house probably 3 years ago when my both daughters were here, and he just showed up because he'd moved back into the area again. Now we're talking, I don't know, 35 years later. And he was sitting there glowing, talking about how Heidi and this other gal and another guy and Andrew, and they would just run the class. Second graders, And of course, he was going against the grain in almost every respect possible for all the other school teachers and, principal and the rest of it. But he had the best results of anybody in the building in terms of their performance. Nobody was ever sick from his class. If they were, they still had to go to school. Man, I can't not be there. So he had developed this method of empowering the students to empower each other and to help each other get their homework done and get everything done. And second grade, I think, is probably really doable for most people. I don't know if you've worked with a lot of second graders, but I find them the easiest. They get things much more quickly. They don't give it an awful lot of analysis. They make their decision early on. They're either with you or they're not. And he was a master at, and both of my girls idolized him. Absolutely. So I don't know who's going to be the flea that teaches the rest of the fleas that you don't have to, you know. And the other thing we used to say when I was coming up, 21 years old, live fast, die young, leave a beautiful corpse. That in the electronics industry, that's how we partied and played and got 3 hours of sleep every single night and still made demanding things happen. So, the meaning of life. Yeah, exactly.
I decided years ago it's just green. And it
Green?
was completely random. It's just because I was thinking on my deathbed, what am I gonna say that's gonna give everybody something to talk about? So my last word will be green, and people can figure out what that means. But don't ask me because I don't know.
Okay, Rosebud.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. I was gonna say, I think that's been done, Ken,
Yeah, yeah.
and I like it.
My other thought too was like another aspect is somebody to believe in somebody else, so it, you could drop your like flea in there, or you could drop an ant that knows no, a grasshopper that believes that the ant can do, I mean that the flea can do it, you know, that kind of thing. Because there's so many
Actually,
people that have come in that have shown just by believing in things, and just kind of what you were saying too, Bill. If you believe in that, those second grade kids can do anything, they'll start believing it too.
years ago, I read a study, and I don't even know how accurate it is or whatever, but it was some global study looking at groups, like organizations, even cities, and they were trying to determine what percentage of a population needed to adopt a new belief for it to tip into being accepted by the majority of that population. And the the research, and this is years ago, so don't even ask me to cite it or how true it is, but the research said it was 10%. And that had a tremendous impact in actually the way I found it like really helpful going into, you go into a classroom and there's 20 kids and there's just connect with two, you know, and if you can find two that really are willing to advocate and kind of buy in and participate, and what I found is if if there was that 10%, if you could identify that 10%, things tended to shift in a more positive direction. And when there wasn't, there was no change. There was just resistance, and it was just a really interesting thing, but it felt like it held pretty true. Working with businesses, working with schools, where a lot of different environments, and it seemed a lot more manageable than you know 50% or 80%, or it's just find the 10%, connect with it. It wasn't even find, just connect with the 10% and then let it spread from there.
Yeah, that's the leverage and activism kind of you know equation as well. If you want to bring something into existence that's not here now, you only need to convince 10% that it's the right thing to do, and everyone else will follow. And you know, the really interesting part of it is we've gone through so much of a dynamic culture in the last 100 years. Well, there's just been so much
Mhm.
mixology, between ideas and philosophies and cultures and histories and all that sort of thing. And the neat part of it is that we're not that far away from 10% in any particular area, but there's been a group of people that have been good at dividing up the 10%. So
I
that
also,
Exactly. Yeah.
I mean, I've been thinking about, as you guys have been talking about, like, so, you know, Ken's experienced it, maybe where he works and in classrooms with kids. And we were talking about those situations where they've actually been able to make a change. And part of what keeps on coming back to me is I think that those successes or those situations, I want to say, are never, and I don't like to use the word publicized, but are never highlighted is a better word. And that troubles me because it doesn't, if you're talking about media or news, it's not news noteworthy, and in a population which is so electronic and so media oriented, I kind of feel like, how do you make that happen? I guess, how do you start to amplify that which is worth amplifying, like, the successes, to show, you know because I think that that's part of the issue.
and it
You know,
really
it's
is.
interesting. there's been a lot of talk lately about the fact that we're wired to pay more attention to the threats. I mean, that's just survival, at a basic level. So, and it's just interesting. And I've found that same frustration. I've done all of these over the years, like different kindness initiatives, and they kind of work, but they never have the same type of, like viral impact that the negative stuff does. And I think it's just got to be the design. Just design the comfortable shoe that people just take for granted, but they're walking better, and they'll notice it when the shoe wears out. You got to be ready to replace it. But it almost feels like, I don't know. I wonder if it's almost kind of a waste of time trying to bring attention to things that we're just not wired to pay attention to in that way. You
Yeah.
know,
Yeah, I mean,
wouldn't it be? I don't know.
so and I think that's a really good point, and that's the way, not like you're doing it for that reason, but part of you is like, well, if it could spread, like, or people heard about it, would more people do it, or would more people think like that? And and so I guess because I hear from people that are in, that I've spoken to a number of times where, like, there's, only, you only bad stuff happens kind of thing in the world, and I'm like, of the exact opposite. I'm always like, oh, there's so much good in the world,
Yeah, I
and
agree.
so many good people in the world. But, I think that there's just too many people out there. That's all they hear. And that's really, truly, I think a lot of people, that's what they believe.
Yeah,
You lay that right at the feet of the people that own the media. And you have to remember 100% we're being trained to do what they want us to do. And that is to consume. That's to make decisions that are going to be in alignment with outcomes that they're hoping for, and for us to spend our money and keep their businesses growing and thriving. So that old saying about good news travels at the speed of a horse, and bad news travels at the speed of a bee. At the end of the day, nobody really clicks on more than one or two good news stories a day. But every time they think there's something that's going to tell them more about what the Kardashians did, or there's something that's going to make somebody look bad, or there's a threat. The one that I heard this weekend, which is like, why would you go ahead and say something like this? But this was the headline. The headline says, recent study predicts that 3/4 of all sea life will be gone in the next 300 years. What? I mean, seriously? Is that newsworthy, Ken?
I guess it depends on how curious you are about sea life and the vulnerability of it and what you want to learn from it. And the problem is, like you said, if the headline was 5 ways we can, tend to our oceans so that they'll be flourishing in the next 300 years, no one would click it. Very few people would click it. So it's kind of like this catch 22. We're going to continue to monetize the negativity by clicking and feeding it our attention, which means that the media companies are going to continue to do what's making them profitable. So, and if the media company stops, then they lose their influence, they lose their monetization, and if we can't not stop, there's no reason for them to change their behavior, and we have to go against our own nature, to make that. So you go around and around. It's just
Yeah.
really hard.
It's like the ebb and flow of training the fleas, right? So here
Yeah,
we are.
yeah.
We are trained like Pavlov's dog, to hear the bell and then immediately take the action. But what I think is neat is that the system. We were always told that the pendulum swings too far to the right and then too far to the left and comes back again. But let's just take a look at Twitter for a second. The number one platform for exchanging ideas on the planet 6 years ago. Number one, ridiculous number of subscribers, made tons of profit. Then came 2016. and 2017. And by 2018 and 2019 and 2020, the subscription rate had fallen off by about 25%. And then after 2020 in the election cycle, it had fallen off by 40%. So now Twitter hasn't made a profit in either 4 years or 3 years. They've lost tons of money during that period of time. I say that fleas that left Twitter were the ones that started the tilt to where somebody else could come in and say, maybe, just maybe, those people have the right idea that this is a toxic environment to have open forumed conversations, and maybe we ought to do something about that. And so the system produced this person who has all the money in the world, who could basically say, let me see, I'll put that on in my Instacart, and then maybe I'll buy McDonald's, and then maybe I'll buy Amazon. And so the point is that when behaviors get out to a certain level, the 80%, the 90% start to develop a new 10% that want something else. And I think we're starting to see some of that happen here. And so the whole idea is be one of the first people that don't click on anything. Be one of the first people that leaves the conversation. Like, Ken, do you watch television?
No, not really. I once in a while I'll watch like a Netflix series that's just because I find, just for something at night. It takes me forever to get through something, but
Yeah.
yeah, I'm still more of a book reader than yeah.
Television is not healthy for children and other living things. It's for the most part. If you're a very discerning, person like you are, I consider myself to be too. I don't watch more than an hour or two of television on a daily basis, and it's usually stuff like great movies. But are you seeing the same thing that I'm seeing in terms of how the system is self-correcting, and that the meaning of life almost never, when someone else is telling you what your life means, can you find a sustainable model inside of that takes you through your entire lifetime? Like, people try different things for a while, don't they?
Mhm. Yeah. I'm still hopeful that everything we're going through right now are just birthing pains. That's my dream anyway. We'll see.
We're waiting for our real life to get here, huh?
Well, it's just, I mean, things things are, things come to an end and other things are born, and
Yeah.
and all of it, all change has discomfort and uncertainty and pain, you know. So it's a we're there's a lot of people on the planet right now. This is challenging, and we're so connected now, and it all happens so fast. That's a lot to process. I mean, it still stuns me just how much has changed in the last 2 decades. That's not a lot of time, you know?
See, that right in and of itself is one of the reasons that when you change a culture very quickly, like for instance, the Asian countries that have become westernized, China's feeling it, Japan's feeling it, South Korea's feeling it. Family's not the main thing in Japan any longer. I don't know if you've done any studying recently, but take a look at how little time that it's taken just the last 100 years to completely turn the Japanese culture upside down. And what the main things that are problematic over there right now have to do with low birth rates, have to do with low rate of marriage, have late to do with people who work for a living so that they can sleep a few hours a night and never get ahead. Very interesting what's going on out there in the world. And the other thing that I'm really, really pleased with is, for the moment, who wants to come to the United States these days? About 6.5 billion people. They know something about it that a lot of us don't or have forgotten. I think that's very interesting. And I do listen every once in a while when they interview some of the folks that are at the southern border. And after they're done talking, I go, I think we ought to let that one in. There's some brilliant people who just want to come here and work hard. I mean, there's some other people that they've got nefarious intent and they're being very successful at the moment. But a lot of the human beings that took that long trek, that shows me something about what they're willing to put into the hat, you know? So everybody know what their meaning of life is now?
Getting there.
It's kind of cool to go through that process of determining like your, you know, kind of your personal purpose or, like, I mean, years ago, doing the whole goal setting thing and you do like a personal mission statement and, that's a little too head based for me at this point, but it is kind of an interesting thing when you're thinking like, for me, it's just positively impacting as many sentient beings as possible within my lifetime and beyond. So that gave it just kind of a broad scope for how to focus my energies and determine, you know, so, for someone, it could just being a good parent or, I mean, whatever. There's so many ways, that you can kind of have like a little bit of a focal point or that allows you to align your life with finding the right communities and doing work that fulfills you and, you know,
Yeah, make the most out of what you got, where you are, and what you can do.
You could take that 10% and apply it to anything. So the books
yeah,
that I've written, take your own personal life and make it 10% better, and then that'll affect somebody else. And then 10% of the human race is a big number. So we've still got a lot of work to do. To start with yourself and make that 10% better every day.
I don't remember who said it, but someone said they wanted to be a billionaire, and what they meant was to affect a billion lives. It wasn't money, it was impact, it was, that kind of thing. So I always like that.
Hmm.
Well, the funny thing, I remember, my take at the Easy Rider and some of the other rebellious coming of age stories of the 1960s and early 1970s. And there were a couple of kids in my class in high school. Like we graduated in '72, and one guy said, he said, I can't wait for June to get here because as soon as I graduate and I toss that cap in the air, I'm boogieing to Canada to avoid the draft. I'm going to shack up with a babe, and we're going to spend 2 years of just finding out what we're here for. And what he ended up doing was going to Bryant College, and, and he became an accountant. But anyhow, so the meaning of my life is something that's always being defined by the people that I'm around and that are with me. And, you know, being in the space of empty and meaningless, not in a nihilistic, fatalistic sort of a way, like there's something wrong, but in a meditative way, that when you're in the space of nothing, that there's room for something to show up. And sometimes that something might be better than your best ideas. So being available to other people and to be kind of, shall we say, you can make requests of me, and if I can pull it off and I want to, I will. And the secret to my success, it's like the Jimmy Valvano statement: don't give up, never give up. Once your mind's made up and you made a decision, find a way. And then after you've accomplished what it was you wanted to accomplish, decide whether it was a good idea. So any closing thoughts? So I will leave with one last one that I'm pulling out of the silence here. You do know that you can be anything that you're willing to stand for being, and that you're willing to work hard enough for it to actually come true. And I really want you to, at home, as well as us, I want you to think in terms of what are the areas in your life where you're choosing not to make a decision that once you make that decision, you're now empowered to go out and do great things. Look for the opportunity to move ahead, and look for the opportunity to share your successes and your failures in such a way that other people can help you along. And be that person that's willing to show the other people that it's okay. And that's the space I'm in today. So thank you all very much for another Lighting the Candle, a world that works. And the world does work, I say. So we'll see you again next week. And for now, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
You've been listening to Lighting the Candle, a world that works, part of the Exvadio Podcast Network. You can catch us each week, as well as the rest of the network, at exvadio.com/podcasts, as well as the Apple Podcasts app, Google Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Stitcher, Audible, Amazon Music, and wherever you find podcasts.